Spring Jazz Group. We have 3 different times during the year we have different jazz bands set up. Our first was the community service performance in December, and then we did our winter jazz band. And this is our spring jazz group, so we've got a couple new faces. Doing 2 tunes for you today. The first one we're going to start with is called Groovin' Hard. It's Don Menza tune, arranged by Peter Blair, I think. We have lots of soloists on this one. You're going to hear from Emma Cryer on the trumpet, Amelia Saltzman on the alto saxophone, AJ Jackson on the trumpet, Dennis Tazigal on the tenor, Jax Berry on the alto, Eli Smith on the guitar, Noah Rao on the trombone, and William Sims on the alto. This is Groovin' Hard. This is one of the things that we do during Tiger Time, one of the groups that we have performed. And I gave them a task, and I said, okay, we're playing Groovin' Hard, and we've been talking about that solo section, which it was wonderful during Groovin' Hard. In the fall, when I asked them who wants to solo, you don't get very many volunteers. And if I asked them, do you want one chorus or two? Just one, just one. And every single one of them wanted a longer chorus so they could develop their ideas, which was fantastic. Love that. And part of this is the same type of thing. So what I told them is, you've got these chord changes. I'm going to play a little bit for you just so you know kind of what I'm talking about. The solo section of Groovin' Hard is a C minor, and then it changes to A flat, and then to G, back to C minor. So those are their chord changes that they're dealing with. And I said, okay, you got to come up with a melody that works with those chord changes. And that was so they got homework for jazz band. And then they came back the next week, and we decided, okay, what are we going to do with that? And so we worked on harmonizing that, coming up with new ideas, and then obviously doing their improvised solos as well with that. So this is what they came up with. Mongo Blue is the title. Afro Blue is a song written by Mongo, and it's in a style of an Afro 12/8 time. So that's where that title came from. So this is Afro, or no, sorry, this is Mongo Blue. I knew I was going to do that. It says Mongo Blue with a jazz combo. Thank you.